visit the breathtaking villa of Gabriele D'Annunzio, the Italian novelist and poet and notorious seducer.
He was an incredible celebrity of his age. He was a poet, he was a war hero, he was just everything. He packed so many lives into his life. Just the most interesting character. And what's fascinating about this place is that you can see all the aspects of his multifaceted personality come to life in the form of an incredible villa. So he started off as a childhood prodigy from quite a poor area of Abruzzi, but went to a famous boarding school, got noticed through his own publicity. He then went to Rome, became a sort of hack journalist writing about the aristocracy. He got a bit jealous of the aristocracy and wanted to be one, so he eloped with a duchess, causing huge scandal. He then wrote a famous novel, Pleasure, which became a bit of a hit, so he became even more famous.
I've been reading Pleasure in the fairly recent Penguin Classics translation, and it is an exquisitely beautiful book. It's filled with evocative descriptions of the lavish, opulent, late 19th century world. But at the same time, it's an extraordinary look at the mind of an arch manipulator, and it's not all beauty because the soul at the heart of it is falling apart under the decadent impulse to fulfill all of his desires.
He became a war hero. He was a pilot. He was very brave and very daring. He became a member of a parliament. He wasn't so good at that. He didn't like actually going into parliament to do the work, but he at least was a member of parliament. He ran his own city-state in Fiume.
What do you mean he had his own country?
Yeah, so after the First World War, there was a disputed town which had an Italian population. He drove into it on a motor car, created a city-state that lasted for 18 months, even though all the allies and no one wanted him to do it. He became commandant of that. International attention, and then Fiume came to a bit of a sad end because the government intervened, his fighters lost, but rather than being sort of put in jail for being a traitor, he was still a national hero and came here to Lake Garda, where he kind of semi-retired. And it's...
This is what happens if you set up a failed city-state. You get a villa like this.
You do, yes. If you set up a failed city-state and you have a battle against your own country's soldiers and lose, you're rewarded with this. When he was here, he used to often send requests to Mussolini for objects and money and so on. And Mussolini never said no.
Wow.
I mean, Mussolini wanted to keep D'Annunzio sweet because Mussolini recognised that if D'Annunzio wrote something about the regime that was negative, that could have massive implications on Mussolini. People listened to D'Annunzio. He had a following of millions, and he knew the publicity machine as well. Mussolini had a description. He said, if you have a bad tooth, i.e. a painful tooth, something that could cause you annoyance, i.e. D'Annunzio writing bad stuff about him, he said you should cap that tooth with gold. And that's what he did. So speedboats, planes, the lot, everything was given to D'Annunzio. He wasn't just attracted or attractive to a few women. We are talking thousands. He was the Casanova of his age. He had such a magnetic attraction. Women would write to him, famous film stars would write to him, actresses would write to him, wanting a meeting, and a meeting, by that I mean inverted commas. When he went to hotels, he would be mobbed by women. I think they loved his writing because he was a celebrity of his age. This guy had incredible magnetism. Some of his lovers were among the most famous women of his age. So Eleonora Duse was the most famous one, who he was with for around 12 years, but he wasn't just with her, he was with many at the same time. Isadora Duncan, the famous American dancer. Sarah Bernhardt, probably the most famous actress in the entire world. He was absolutely magnetic. I mean, it's quite easy to describe him as a kind of Latin lover and all kind of have a laugh about it, but there's definitely a dark side. Not all of those women ended their meeting with D'Annunzio feeling great, to say the least. This is Eleonora Duse, the most famous actress in Italy, an incredibly talented, incredibly strong woman, independently wealthy. He didn't go for women who were necessarily needy. He really respected strong, powerful women. They had a slightly strange relationship, it has to be said. He had many lovers whilst he was seeing her, but he definitely had huge intellectual respect for her and wrote plays for her, poems about her and so forth. And it's very interesting when you go to the villa. In his study, which is the most important room in the house, there is, under a veil, the bust of Eleanora Duse.
Why is it under a veil?
He wanted her there because she was his intellectual muse. She was the one who could discuss the opinions he had and so forth and really hold him at his own. But he found her so excitingly attractive that I think the memories of their time together, they were sort of voracious lovers, was just too much to allow him to concentrate on his work.
So he had to veil the bust.
He did, yes. It does end a little bit sadly with Eleanora, though. He was quite cruel to her, and in the end she went a little bit mad, and they couldn't live together any longer. But the fact that he still has her bust shows that there was still a little flame in his heart for her.
But is that what he did? Did he ruin women's equilibrium and then move on?
Yeah, I mean, D'Annunzio and women is just it's a very strange topic. So he would spend ages seducing a woman, he would write them poetry and so forth. Then after the seduction, literally he would send them packing very often and never want to speak to them again. So his servants would get rid of them from the house. He had a real obsession with hands. He just loved the beauty of hands, and he himself loved gloves. He used to always steal a glove of one of his lovers. So his trophy from his many, many lovers was to take a glove. And also he had this strange thing where he kind of got excited by people who were ill.
Of course, there are things like La Traviata and lots of books where the heroines were consumptive. They were very frail, and yet they were the great loves of people's life. But I wouldn't have expected that frailty to move into the bedroom. And this is a description of his first love scene with Elena when she first gives herself to him. He walks into the room, which smells of chloroform, because she's had to take some because she's so unwell. So already it's smelling like a hospital. This doesn't seem great. She smiled, her head pressed back into the pillows, supine in the half-light. A band of white wool was wrapped around her forehead and cheeks, passing under her chin like a nun's wimple. The skin of her face was as pale as that bandage. The outer corners of her eyelids clenched with the painful contraction of her inflamed nerves. At intervals, her lower lid had a small, involuntary tremor, and her eyes were damp, infinitely sweet, as if veiled by a tear that could not brim over, almost imploring between her trembling lashes. It goes in about 3 minutes between that and her kissing him, falling back again, and offering herself to him.
It's a little bit odd because when one's ill, one's not normally in the mood for kissing.
Headaches don't usually go in the mood with kissing. And what's even stranger is that immediately after they make love, afterward an immense sadness invaded her. She was filled with that obscure sadness which is at the base of all human happiness, just as brackish water is to be found at the mouth of all rivers. And I find that very interesting because I think that's the trouble with decadence, that it's pushed the search of pleasure to the extreme, and in fact it leaves people feeling a little bit disgusted with themselves. And I'm not sure that D'Annunzio knew that that was this brackish water, but I think it's disgust at a complete loss of control. Can someone be truly happy when they're hurting the people that they love more than anyone in the world? Is that possible? I don't think so.
I know. I mean, D'Annunzio could be described, I guess, as a decadent writer. So it was kind of how Romanticism evolved, I think. And I think it just had this slightly dark edge where it was just taken to extreme. So eroticism was linked with pain and all this kind of stuff. And I think for D'Annunzio, there was nothing sort of more appealing than a frail woman on her deathbed or with a serious illness. He found them even more attractive when they were in that sort of vulnerable state. He was actually a journalist writing for the Tribuna, almost in a sort of Tatler style. So he would be going to the plays and theatres and parties, writing about the aristocracy. And he wasn't a member of the aristocracy. And I think it was quite galling for him because in his hometown, he was the son of the main man in the town, the mayor of Pescara. It's a very small town. When he came to Rome, he was kind of no one, and journalists or hacks were thought of as the lowest of the low. So he spent many evenings writing about women's wonderful dresses and the material, describing it in intricate details. You've probably seen that in some of his books. He talks about the fabrics and the play.
Fortuny fabrics.
Well, he eventually became good friends with Fortuny. interestingly, and he used to dress Eleonora Duse in Fortuny as well.
I found the moment in the book where the protagonist sees Elena, the love of his life, certainly at the beginning of the novel, walking upstairs. He's never met her before, and she's walking in front of him. She was going up before him slowly with a supple and measured pace, her mantle lined with a snowy fur like swan's down, no longer held up by its clasp, was lying loosely around her upper body, leaving her shoulders bare. Her shoulders emerged, pale as polished ivory, divided by a soft hollow with shoulder blades that, disappearing below the lace of her bodice, had a brief curve like the sweet slope of wings. And from her shoulders rose her neck, agile and rounded, and from the nape of her neck her hair, gathered in a coil, folded over at the crown of her head to form a knot, held in place by jewelled hairpins.
Oh, wow.
Every detail of her hair, her jewels, her cape, the way she's walking, he's described.
He spent an absolute fortune on his wardrobe.
I like a man who dresses well.
Well, he had this view that life itself, an individual life, could be a work of art. You wouldn't get many poets nowadays that could, or playwrights even, that could afford all of this. No. And the fact is he couldn't really. He was permanently in debt. So after he'd married his first wife, and bear in mind she was a duchess, they lived in abject poverty to the point that actually the debt collectors took away all their possessions apart from literally the clothes on their back. They couldn't afford even the basic bills or the rent. But what was so strange is that didn't seem to stop him. So that even when he was in abject poverty and he couldn't feed his own children, if money came in at all, he would go and spend it on a jade ornament. I mean, it literally had no sense. If he was in debt, he might leave a hotel. Would he go to a cheaper hotel? No, he'd go to a more expensive hotel.
So he wouldn't pay the bill at the first
No, he left so many hotels without paying the bills, it's a joke. I mean, some of the hotels he stayed in wouldn't actually charge him because he'd write the cheque, but he was so famous that they'd want to keep the autograph on the cheque and didn't want to cash it in. Think about the most famous pop stars of the day. He was that and more. He was actually a little bit shorter than you. He was about 1.58 meters.
Right, yeah.
But he made up for it in terms of his stature and so on. You know, he had a real presence in a room, that's for sure. You know, and he may not be the sort of classical Adonis, but he certainly took a lot of care about how he looked. So he used to work out the whole time. He had a sort of boxing thing in his house. He was very much into physical fitness. He wasn't just the sort of poet who sat at his desk all day. Physical fitness, horse riding was a massive thing for him. He was a real sort of sporty man. But I tell you what, he may have been a sporty man, but also he had some more sort of effeminate qualities in terms of his looking after his appearance. I need to show you some of it over here. I'm pretty sure this is the perfume that he invented himself.
Ooh, I didn't know
Aquanuntia. You can see he's written down the sort of recipe for it over here.
Aquanuntia.
He's such a man of contrast though, isn't he?
What contrast? I mean, a man who incites people to war and then spends his evenings creating a wonderful perfume.
But also a man who does boxing, who loves physical exercise. It's just wonderful how he's combined everything, and he does everything to excess. He totally lives his life to the full. Am I meant to be using all of these every day before I go out?
Honestly, I'm embarrassed, Oliver, to hear that you don't use all of those things every day before going. I can imagine the power he would have had over women, actually, because there's something to please everybody. Someone who likes a macho man, someone who likes an effeminate man, somebody who likes a poet, somebody who likes a warmonger. I mean, all women would have been drawn to him in different ways.
Look at this, lined with gold. It's quite a dressing gown, bit of bling.
Just the ticket.
I think I can see myself in that.
Yes. Okay, Oliver, I'm with you with all of his other clothes, but there's a missing piece to this one. There's a nightgown with a missing piece.
Oh dear.
Would you like to talk me through this?
I think there may have been a moth and his housekeeper repaired it. I have no idea. Interestingly, the only wish that wasn't granted to D'Annunzio was D'Annunzio asked for there to be an airstrip built for him because he loved flying planes. And for that, Mussolini said no. And the reason Mussolini said no, of course, was he didn't want D'Annunzio to escape. Because like it or not, this, towards the end of D'Annunzio's life, became almost a prison. I mean, probably a little bit of a self-imposed one, but there's no doubt that had D'Annunzio wanted to start moving around, then probably Mussolini would have not been so pleased.
So it was a gilded cage.
It was a gilded cage, and he became almost a recluse here, and that was absolutely perfect for Mussolini. So as long as he stayed here, the gifts would keep on going.
Well, after an introduction like that, Ollie, I am going to have to go and see inside. Sharpish. Ooh. Oh, the facade.
It's amazing, isn't it?
The very first thing I think of when I come here is the unification of Italy. I mean, surely that's what the facade is representing, Ollie. What do you think? Because I can see the two lines of St. Mark over the doors.
Yes.
That represents Venice. And I'm pretty sure that all of the others must represent the different Italian states before unification.
I think you're probably right. He definitely was an ardent Italian.
Oh yes, you can see that. This screams Italy on arrival.
So Stephanie, before we go into the villa, when the tour starts, this door's going to open. When you go inside, you can either go left or right. So which way would you choose?
I think I would naturally veer to the right, I think.
Like economy class. Yes. Well, funnily enough.
Been doing it all my life.
Funnily enough, going to the right is not the right answer.
Cool.
Because that's where the people that D'Annunzio didn't like went. So people were here to collect debt, politicians and so forth. It was to the left where his friends and his lovers went.
Ooh. So you had to hope that you were going to be welcomed towards the left as you walked up the stairs.
If D'Annunzio is your type of guy, I mean, I don't know, you tell me.
Well, I'll tell you once we've had a look around.
So, what did you think?
Honestly, I'm shell-shocked. I found it this weird mixture of absolute beauty and utter creepiness. I don't know, what didn't you find?
There were some bits I loved about it. I loved the way he named the rooms. I loved the way every object he cared about. There were 10,000 objects in there.
Yes, the room names, the one over the door to the bedroom, which was genius and pleasure. I want that over my bedroom.
I loved that. I just found it a little bit too much in terms of things.
I don't like the room of the leper.
No.
I'll be honest, I don't think it's a good idea to name a room in your house the room of the leper. I don't think it gives a very cheerful atmosphere.
The Dalmatian oratory, the corridor of the Way of the Cross, I just love the way he named rooms. Everything was important to him, everything was thought about. So I loved that. I'd like to do that, I'd name the room.
I'm going to do that.
But I tell you what though, the room I found a little bit odd was the bedroom.
Oh, me too. I found the bedroom a little bit disturbing and I was expecting to find it beautiful. This was an art seducer. I was expecting sumptuousness, colour, passion, seduction. But actually, it was really dark and oppressive, and the bed was really tiny. Oh, I don't know, I found it a bit creepy.
So definitely turn right.
I'll be turning right. I'd rather sit with the creditors.
So Stephanie, we've done the villa, and now we're going to do probably the most exciting bit, which is the garden.
It is spectacular. Behind you, I can see an oleander in flower. I can see cypress trees, Lake Garda. It's beautiful.
The reason the garden is important, though, or exciting, isn't just because of the plants. There's some rather interesting objects dotted around.
Oh, you're going to take me to see them?
I think I will, yes. Follow me.
Okay, I can see something ridiculous from here.
So what we have here is half a battleship built into the hillside, as you do in your garden.
See, I had actually heard that D'Annunzio had a battleship, but he lives on a lake, so I presumed it was a full battleship in the water.
Oh, no, definitely not.
Why do you have half a
This
battleship?
arrived by train, I think, on like 20 different carriages and was carried up the hill in parts and then reassembled. Not only was he sent a battleship by Mussolini, he was also sent a company of soldiers, so D'Annunzio could come out and kind of give them drill in the morning, raise the flag.
Can you show me how it's done? Let's go down there and you can
Well,
show me
I
under
did used to be in the Naval Reserve, of course.
Oh, of course.
So I can march. And anyone who knows me would know my coordination is a little bit limited.
Limited
But-
doesn't do justice to the sheer lack of coordination.
But when I went
that you
to my naval training, I actually met, and you're not going to believe this, I met someone who had worse coordination than I did.
have. Nope, don't believe it.
So every morning, this is in Dartmouth Royal Naval College, we had to go and do our marching practice, and it's kind of like this. It's not a particularly difficult march.
You're
It's
making
the
it look
Royal
more like
Navy
a
march.
stroll, actually.
Well,
It looks
exactly.
nothing
But
like a
this.
march.
It was like this. It was like this. But there was a guy who just couldn't get it. And bear in mind, there's about 200 cadets, and we're all trying to march, very serious, with all the admirals looking at us. And there was this guy who marched like this. I am not joking. Literally like this. We were in peals of laughter. We couldn't keep a straight face. He was like the worst marcher in the history of Dartmouth Naval College.
No, come on, that march is not going to impress D'Annunzio. Keep going, Oliver, you stop marching.
Sorry, oh, Commandant. You're quite a hard task.
Faster marching.
No, that's actually a good march. So I'd like you to do the mal-coordinated march. So it's both at the same time. This way.
I feel we've gone a bit off topic on this.
One of D'Annunzio's gifts to the world, in a way, was the politics of theatre and of spin and of PR. And there are so many examples of this.
Is that a gift?
Well, I don't know. Having worked in PR myself in the past, possibly. I mean, it started in a really early age. So did you know that after he had his first book published of poetry by his dad was a big supporter. So it's a private publication when they were I think he was 16. And he wanted to get some publicity for the book. And he'd thought about the sort of English authors like Shelley and so forth, who, because they had died so early, had got real fame through their early deaths. So do you know what he did?
What?
He wrote a letter to the newspapers in Italy saying that he had been killed by falling from a horse. So then they wrote all these articles across all the papers of Italy talking about the young upcoming poet who died tragically. And of course he wasn't dead at all, but that actually helped cement his fame at very early days.
And taught him early on about the press.
Yes, and propaganda and so forth.
It really is all theatre, because look, you only got half a battleship, and you can see the wooden boards of the battleship here. But if we turn around, look at the other half of the battleship. This has just been built in a garden. This isn't a ship at all. At this side, it's a terrace in the same shape as the rest of the battleship. And it's made to look like planks, but it's only tiles.
It's like a stage set.
Yeah, so he didn't just put the half of battleship, he recreated the other half and just made this wonderful stage set for his little marches.
But there is no doubt that D'Annunzio's speeches helped force Italy into war. So the Parliament didn't want to go to war. This is the First World War. D'Annunzio was in exile in Paris at the time. When I say in exile, he was escaping debts, but he called it exile.
He called Debt
Yes.
Escape Exile.
He did call Debt Escape
Talk about
exile.
making life theatre.
Yeah. So fast forward to 1915, beginning of the war. D'Annunzio is in France, and he knows he wants to go back to Italy. But he's not just going to go back. He wants to go back in flames. He wants to create an entrance. He wants people to be talking about the fact he's come back to Italy. But then he gets a letter from the grandson of Garibaldi. So the great Garibaldi, who was key with his 1,000 red shirts to unifying Italy in 1860, a real mythological figure as well. Garibaldi's grandson said that they were creating a monument to Garibaldi in Genoa. But do you know what? Rather than just go and open the monument, which he'd been invited to do, D'Annunzio decided he was going to have 2,000 red shirts.
Not 1,000, not enough.
2,000. And not just typical shirts, but silk shirts designed by a French couturier. So that's what he did. So this was, and they were swirling around the monument. This was hugely dramatic. So D'Annunzio was using this spectacle to put immense pressure onto the Italian government to enter the war. He then went to Rome, where he spoke in front of 100,000 people. He had this hypnotic way of using words to rouse the crowds. This was written about across Italy in all the newspapers. He went on a tour of speeches. People weren't even necessarily interested in what he was saying, it was the way he said it. People said that when they heard him speak, he kind of hypnotized them. So he thought very carefully about, it was almost like words like music. And they just became enchanted. He was all about spectacle. He was all about theatre. And this really set the foundation for so much politics, from fascism right through to the modern day. I think we have to remember Italy was actually a very young nation, and I think D'Annunzio was born just a few years later, in 1863 or 4. So this was a period where war wasn't seen as a bad thing by many people. It was seen as a glorious thing. It was seen as a way of a nation proving itself. They weren't alone. Many nations felt the same. D'Annunzio himself went to a boarding school that was run on militaristic lines. At the end of his school career, he was promoted to commandant of the school because all the pupils were given military names. So this was a militarized time. So context is important when before we judge and so forth. I mean, come on, who wouldn't want a battleship in their garden? It's so cool.
You want a battleship, don't you?
I do.
You told Camilla you want a battleship.
Well, we have a very small garden, but I still want a battleship.
Honestly, you are much safer on a naval ship on dry land than you ever were in a naval ship on water, so I think it's a great idea.
Stephanie, I said this garden was more spectacular than average. So what have we found?
A whole amphitheatre?
Who doesn't need an amphitheatre in their garden? Such a wonderful setting. Can you imagine? This is what we should do. If we could speak Italian, which would be a help,
Yes.
we would come here and see one of D'Annunzio's plays.
Idyllic. Imagine being able to sit with Lake Garda behind you, watching one of D'Annunzio's plays in his own home. Did he see his plays here?
The sad thing is no. So the plan for this happened when he was still alive, Moroni, the architect, and it was started when he was still alive in 1934. But unfortunately, it took until, I think, the early 50s to finish. So it's really sad. And actually, what's incredibly tragic is that several times during his life, D'Annunzio had tried to set up a national theatre and had tried to get funding for a national theatre. So with Eleanor Duse, his mistress for a while, she was a very famous actress, and they both tried to fundraise to create this theatre, but it never happened.
You knew a lot about D'Annunzio before we came here, so how does this make you feel to see his home?
I think it actually makes me quite inspired. I'm just like, how did this man have so much energy and so much passion for life and passion for beauty? And I think on a personal note, I remember sort of 20 years ago when I had my first flat, which I actually shared with Michael Potts, who many of our viewers will know. And both of us were really into making that flat look absolutely beautiful. And I think this has inspired me that actually, wherever we live, whatever the size of our home, whatever, we can make even the smallest things mean something and be really beautiful. And I think that's what I want to do. I think if we can all do that, wouldn't this be a wonderful place to live? What's hilarious is that D'Annunzio took a huge interest in every single detail of this garden, every single detail of everything, actually. That was kind of what he stood for as a person. But even after he was dead, he was still giving instructions, apparently.
What?
Yes, the architect and builder of the villa who helped translate D'Annunzio's kind of vision into reality. After D'Annunzio had died, he insisted with Mussolini that he was communicating with D'Annunzio via seances. so
No.
from the dead.
No, Oliver.
And was being given instructions about more structures to build within the garden.
Well, that's very convenient for the architect.
Yes, it was just a way of securing your income.
Yeah. I mean, if your client dies, just say they're still talking to you from beyond the grave. You can see just how huge the villa is from here. And yet we saw 2 bedrooms, both of which were for D'Annunzio, in one of which he would share it with a rotating number of different women, and the other was for when he wanted to chill out by himself. I have never seen such a narcissistic house design in my entire life. 2 bedrooms, both for the owner, and about 5 studies and libraries we counted. I can't believe you've made me walk all the way to the top of a hill.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I
I
keep
mean,
doing
look
that.
how far we are from the villa. There's the villa.
This, of course, here, which is what we've come to last, is the mausoleum of D'Annunzio. When D'Annunzio died, a phone call was made to the Mussolini's office, as you'd expect, because Mussolini was very interested about what was going on here. And it said that the servant overheard someone in the background saying, "At last."
Ooh, ouch.
And I think that says it all, because in a way, D'Annunzio was always the kind of the other big figure in Italy. And I think whenever he was here, D'Annunzio remained a little bit of a threat to Mussolini, because D'Annunzio could have written anything at any point, and had that got out to the rest of Italy, that would have undermined Mussolini. That's why he actually had a full-time spy within the house, living here.
A full-time spy here.
Yeah, theoretically a bodyguard that D'Annunzio asked for, actually, because he was being besieged by his legionaries the whole time trying to come and visit him. So he asked one, but I think D'Annunzio actually already knew that Mussolini was spying on him anyway. So he thought it's better to have the spy in the house, so I can charm.
Useful as well.
Yeah, so he could charm the spy. And actually, what happened is that he was able to work with Mussolini's spy and actually make sure that the messages getting out were that D'Annunzio was behaving himself. So he was quite sensible about that. But what was also interesting was that Mussolini wasn't the only one spying on D'Annunzio.
Cool.
No, so D'Annunzio had one of his lovers called Emmy, who lived with him in this house for the last few years of his life, as well as his wife and his house mistress, cum concubine, and so on. And the day D'Annunzio died, Emmy packed up her stuff and got the train and went to Germany, and was next found in the office of von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister. So the Nazis had a live-in spy as a lover of D'Annunzio for the last few years of his life as well. Such was the realization by both Mussolini and Hitler of the power of D'Annunzio's words right up to the end.
Extraordinary.
I fear the rains are coming. It's the curse of the Englishman. He brings his weather with him. It was said that D'Annunzio loved dogs even more than he loved women, which is saying an awful lot.
Well, I suspect the dogs didn't answer back.
No. So for most of his life, he was an avid greyhound keeper. Raced them, won prizes and so on. Often had like 20 or 30 greyhounds. But for some reason, when he came here, in the latter years of his life, he chose Great Danes, which happened to be one of my favourites. Camilla. This is what I want in my house. So we've got them actually laying faithfully by his grave. I mean, in a sense, it does reflect D'Annunzio, because we have his followers buried all around, and then we have the D'Annunzian Superman in the middle. So they are almost kind of worshipping and paying homage to D'Annunzio, which I'm sure he would have loved. But on the other hand, I'm not sure he would have loved so much the design. In many ways, he was adopted as a fascist figurehead after he died, whereas I'm not sure he'd ever been quite a fascist figurehead before that. I'm so glad they're here, because I do think there is much more to D'Annunzio than the sort of image there is in the UK of him being a sort of a fascist and a fascist supporter. There was a huge humanity, a huge joy of life, and I'm glad that there is at least a symbol of that in this dog here.
Right, here we go. I'm not one for hanging around in mausoleums, but why not? I'll follow you anywhere, Oliver.
Wow.
Oh,
That's a bit
very shiny. No, I think we should go in.
Really?
I can't stay away from something that shiny.
Let me take
Ooh, slightly creepy.
So what we have here, on this side and this side, is the names of the legionaries, and those were the soldiers who helped defend Fiume, and the ones who actually died defending Fiume are honoured here.
Well, this is snug. How do we get ourselves into these situations, Ollie? We are sheltering in a mausoleum
I know.
in Italy.
I know. Come to Italy, come to the sun.
This is so typical.
Oh, it's jolly British. I like it.
Tell you what, though, at least it's a mausoleum with a view.
Yeah. All we need is a cup of tea, don't we?
Oh, can you imagine how nice that would be if we brought a thermos?
A bit of Earl Grey and a slice of fruitcake. For me, there are sort of two ways you can think about D'Annunzio when we're sitting there on his grave. When you think about his legacy, I think there is the dark legacy, and I think it's worth talking about that. So there is no doubt that through his speeches, he helped destabilise the Italian government and forced Italy into war. There is absolutely no doubt that Mussolini, that Stalin, that Hitler took so many of the ideas of how to stage politics as theatre. Thousands of people in mass rallies, all of that came from D'Annunzio as well. And on the personal side, the many women whose hearts he broke, some he drove to suicide and so on. So we can't forget those things.
On that note, Ollie, I'd like to read something from the Prelude to Pleasure. And D'Annunzio wrote this in a convent to Francesco Paolo Michetti. This book, composed in your house as a welcome guest, comes to you as an offering of thanks. And in this letter to Francesco, he writes, I smile when I think that this book, where I examine, not without sadness, so much corruption and so much depravity and so much vain insidiousness and falseness and cruelty, has been written amid the simple, serene peace of your house, between the last starlings of the harvest and the first pastorals of the snow, while my pages grew together with the precious life of your small son. Certainly, if there is any human compassion and goodness in my book, I render thanks to your son. Nothing inspires tenderness and uplifts one as much as the sight of life unfolding. Even the vision of dawn cedes its place to that wonder. And I think that quote sums up D'Annunzio. He was drawn to darkness. He was drawn to following pleasure too deeply. And he knew that about himself. And he realised that he wished to go towards the light more. But I feel that he didn't manage that in his own life, but he did manage it in his words.
So Stephanie, we started this vlog with the question of what do you do with artists who have the dark side as well as the light side? However you analyse D'Annunzio's life, there is no doubt there was a lot wrong with the man. There was a lot that was kind of dark. So who else had a dark side?
So many poets. I mean, Byron, obviously, T.S. Eliot, Caravaggio. I mean, the list goes on. And we each have to decide, are we going to take the beauty that they left in the world, or are we going to throw all of that away with the way that they lived? And I choose, for me personally, to keep the beauty that there is in the world. And I am absolutely loving pleasure. There are phrases in this that resonate in me, that I feel whenever I walk into a room, and that I think can become part of the way that I look at the world. Certainly the other side of D'Annunzio is not going to become part of the way that I look at the world, and that's a choice that we each have to make individually. I'm going to go back to the very first page of the novel Pleasure, because the entire first page is filled with the most amazing description of the rooms of the narrator Sperelli. The rooms were slowly filling with the scent emanating from fresh flowers in vases. Thick, fat roses were immersed in certain crystal goblets that rose, slender, from a sort of gilded stem, widening into the shape of a diamond lily, similar to those that appear behind the Virgin in the Tondo by Sandro Botticelli at the Galleria Borghese. No other form of goblet equals in elegance such a form. The flowers in that diaphanous prison seem almost to become spiritual, resembling rather a religious or loving offering. Andrea Sperelli was awaiting a lover in his rooms. Juniper wood burned in the fireplace, and the small tea table was ready, set with majolica cups and saucers from Castel Durante, decorated with mythological scenes. Light entered the room, softened by curtains of red brocade with pomegranates, leaves, and mottos embossed in spun silver.
As the afternoon sun struck the window panes, the flowered design of the lace curtains cast its shadow on the carpet.
Beautiful.
Doesn't that set a scene for a novel about pleasure?
And that's why women from across Italy would write to him wanting to meet him.
And fall at his feet.
Yes, they were literally beautiful words, so hypnotic.
So on that note,
Uh-huh.
I think it might be time for a drink.
Oh, yes, please. Okay, little cocktail, maybe some local Pinot Grigio,
I think, yes.
little trattoria.
D'Annunzio would have done the same.
Right. We must follow in his footsteps when it comes to finding delicious food.
But
and
we'll
wine.
pay the bill. He would have done a runner.
No, we'll pay. This is our view over dinner. Can you believe it? And you're already nibbling everything. That focaccia is amazing, isn't it? It's warm. This is my favourite vlogging of the day, Ollie. You're a lot quieter than usual. The appetizer has just arrived, and it's bacalao. Cod. Oh, and I love bacalao. I'm going in. Here we go. I can't believe where we are.
On a beautiful terrace on Lake Garda, there is Isola del Garda over there. And it is absolutely sublime. Cheers, everyone.
It's the perfect end to the perfect
It
day.
is.
Thanks,
Thank you very
Oliver,
much.
for a day in paradise.
Thank you, Stephanie.